Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the AMA NOLA monthly get together to talk about marketing, and we have a really cool topic today. So I just want to say welcome again. Thank you for taking the time to be with us on this last Wednesday of the month. I can't believe we're at the end of April. Oh my goodness. It's a gorgeous day out there. I did some exercise outside this morning. It was actually kind of hot. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mariska Morse. I am the president of the AMA NOLA chapter, and I'm here with Anna Ladon, who is our head of programming for the AMA NOLA chapter. And in just a little bit, I'll be introducing our speaker, Stephanie Douglas, with MDRG. But again, welcome to our session today. I'm so glad you could join us because we're talking about some really important stuff and interesting. And as I sort of reflected on the topic of conversation today, social justice and marketing, social justice and your brand, but specifically the consumer point of view. What is the consumer thinking about how marketers are engaging with social justice topics? And as I was reflecting on that topic, I thought, you know what, this isn't new. Marketers have been getting engaged in social justice topics for quite some time. But I don't recall actually what MDRG has done, which is really ask the consumer, what do they think about the role of marketing getting engaged with social justice topics. But for example, bring yourselves back many years. Back in 2004, I believe it was the Dove commercials had a whole campaign, a very successful campaign that they have reintroduced many times called Real Beauty. In 2017, Western Union had a campaign called The Race is On. And more recently in 2019, Levi's had a gender equity campaign called I Shape My World. And then similarly around Black Lives Matter, brands such as Lego, Ben & Jerry's, Nickelodeon have all had a very strong presence around around Black Lives Matter and supporting it and really coming out in a big way to support Black Lives Matter. So I'm excited to kind of see the research behind it, see what consumers are thinking. I know that in this past year in the pandemic, if you remember back in I think it was in April, we got all of the messages from our companies that you follow. I'm sure your inbox was full of messages around the pandemic and keeping safe, and we want everyone to be safe. And then it was like 2 months later when we had a lot of the racial tension going on, a lot of the protests around George Floyd, all very important. But then there was another slew of emails with all of these different companies stating their support of Black Lives Matter. And then most recently, obviously what's happening in Georgia and around the country around voter suppression, many brands have really stood up and made their thoughts known, specifically Coca-Cola, Delta, Major League Baseball. So it's not only a topic that has been with us for quite some time, but obviously very, very relevant today. So again, thank you for being here. I want to thank the entire board of our AMA NOLA chapter. Everyone is very involved in putting on these events and programs, making our website look extra special. So a big shout out to the entire board who has been really fun. We've been a new board this year. We're coming sort of toward the end of our first year of working together, and it's been a great team. I'm so honored to be working with all of them. Today, really, while you are not on the screen, we invite you to be as interactive as possible. Please use the Q&A box to throw questions out there. Anna and I will be on top of whatever's coming in through the chat or the Q&A box. I have a couple of links to articles that I might put out there. But at any point, if you've got a question for Stephanie, please put it in the Q&A box. We'll probably wait till the end for sort of the robust conversation around her data. But if a question comes to mind, throw it in there and we will address that. I would be remiss as the head of this chapter to not talk about the benefits of being a member of AMA. In fact, before I started today, before getting online today, I checked out some of the upcoming webinars with the National American Marketing Association. So first and foremost, you join AMA, you will be part of an awesome, just local marketing group. There's such talent in this city in terms of marketers, the agencies, the professionals, the work that's being done, everything from content marketing to video to branding. We have awesome agencies, we have fantastic professionals, and we want everyone to feel like AMA NOLA is a go-to resource. But in addition, you also have the benefits of AMA National. And just to give you a heads up, like, for example, you join AMA, which is so inexpensive, $149 for the year. You get all of these amazing benefits. But just for example, May 14th, there's a webinar called Accelerate Your Marketing Funnel with Conversational Marketing. There's another one called Journal of Marketing webinar for marketing professionals, a Google update, something else called A Single Source of Truth, Possible or Paradox. There's just constantly great marketing topics that AMA National provides. I typically, with my old marketing team at Forte, would do a lunch and learn, and we would each watch a webinar and then talk about it once a month, just to kind of keep up to date on our marketing acumen. So anyway, highly recommend you check out becoming a member so that you can connect with us locally as well as with the national chapter. And last but not least, I want to get this party started and introduce our speaker, Stephanie. Stephanie Douglas, we are so honored that you are sharing your time and all of this fantastic data with us today. Let me do a little bit of an intro. I like to go to people's LinkedIn profiles to see what is kind of in there. Here's a little bit of feedback. So this great little statement about Stephanie was in her LinkedIn profile. Working under Stephanie was the best gift I could have gotten in terms of starting my career, as she's been my mentor, my role model. She's extremely sharp, approachable in a very rare way with endless patience. She would answer any question I had, making sure to explain the concepts holistically. I mean, it goes on and on. So that just gives you a sense of what an awesome person Stephanie is. She's currently the Senior Director of Marketing and Operations for MDRG Inc. And I know she is leading the charge over there. She also, if you know of a restaurant in Metairie called Blue Line Sandwich, she is the owner and founder of Blue Line Sandwich Company, a restaurant in Old Metairie. So big plug to Blue Line, please go check out the restaurant. And then she's got some great other experience. She was the marketing account manager for Clear Results, and she was director of operations and accounts at Grit Marketing, and she is a graduate of LSU with a major in broadcast journalism. So lots of experience that Stephanie's bringing to us today, and I'm going to hand it over to her now to present the research.
Thank you so much, Mariska. I really appreciate that. That's embarrassing, but you went to my LinkedIn to get that, but nice to hear and be reminded anyway.
Great. I love it.
Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen. Let me make sure I do that. All right, so yeah, I am going to talk today a little bit about some research that MDRG did over this past summer surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement. We began tracking consumer behavior weekly at the start of the COVID pandemic, knowing full well that there'd be a significant impact on the way people consume brands and products. But at the time, what we didn't know was that the country would really enter a time of reckoning for racial injustices spurred by the death of George Floyd. So at the time, after 10 weeks of tracking consumer behavior related to COVID, we pivoted a portion of our study to track thoughts and feelings regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. And so this research remains relevant 9 months later almost, and still underscores the importance for brands to use their voice appropriately. Now, there are some changes, and I'll talk a little bit about what I've looked up recently as far as kind of how consumer sentiment is changing since then, and I'll address that as we go. And as the nation really continues to grapple with the pandemic, the racial justice movement continues right alongside it. You know, we've seen that, and we've continued to see Black Americans killed by police. And we've seen states like Georgia and Arkansas pass more restrictive voter laws. And, you know, we've seen this impact this impact our clients in that they're trying to find ways to look internally at their own organizations and understand how they need to change, from internal policies and procedures to the way that they communicate with their customers, and on a larger scale, what their brands are willing to stand for. And one of the ongoing questions that was underlying a lot of the work we were doing this summer was, how do we respond as an organization? Will our response help push the movement forward? And what impact will this have on our brand? So this research attempts to give some direction to brands as far as what next steps should be for organizations based on current consumer mind states regarding racial inequity. Although, we acknowledge at the time and still now, we're still just at a starting point as far as addressing this in our country. So why not start with a quote from a pop culture figure? COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. And when I talk about Black Lives Matter, I want to clarify, we think of it as the movement, not the organization itself, because that's the way it was spoken about over the past summer. So these two issues are serious. They're pervasive in pop culture, even more so back in the summer and spring of last year. And Lizzo really captures the feeling of the time in this particular Instagram post that was a response to the murder of George Floyd, where she says, "I wonder what would happen if all the big companies and celebrities who have showed support on social media came out and used their platform to let activists and protesters speak and be seen. I wonder what would happen if we allowed the outrage to have positive influence in our local government. What would happen if those in power defunded the police and dismantled their racist culture and corrupt power structures? Cities are burning. Are you watching? I stand with Minneapolis. I believe in us. Change is going to come." And so that quote just really reiterates kind of the thought and the feelings and the sentiment at the time that was on social media and pervasive in media in general. And we were seeing this optimism regarding change within our own research. Consumers envision a transformation and recognize that it's a process and a journey, and are optimistic that the movement would spark action. So jumping right in the week immediately following the murder of George Floyd by police, we were in the field asking consumers how they felt about the protests. We used OMET, online metaphor elicitation, which I will go into more deeply in the next few slides for those of you that are not familiar. But broadly, consumers viewed the protests positively. There were those that understood and appreciated the goals of the protests, but didn't believe in the means. But as a whole, consumers viewed the protests as a path to a more fair and just society, and were hopeful that they can eliminate racial inequality through unity and solidarity. We saw quotes like, "I would like to see justice and fairness. I want to see less hatred among people. Our world is so divided and full of hate." Or, "Through unity, we can change the institutional racism which leads to injustice." So over the following 4 weeks, we surveyed about 2,000 consumers about A, their support for the Black Lives Matter movement, B, their optimism that the movement would inspire lasting societal change, C, their support for brands speaking out in support of the movement, and then finally, the most effective actions brands can take to show support of the movement, which was most important for our clients. So over the next few minutes, we'll take you through the findings as it relates to the support for the movement, as well as the complex emotions at play and the most effective actions brands can take. So as part of the study, as I mentioned, we had respondents participate in an online metaphor elicitation exercise. And this reveals the deep subconscious emotions consumers have towards the movement and racial inequity in general. And one of the things that we do at MDRG is we make it a point to blend conscious and non-conscious responses, or what some refer to as System 1 and System 2 thinking, in order to really tell a more complete story with more context, understanding, and actionable insights. So this is an exercise, this online metaphor elicitation, or OMET, that helps us better understand how consumers are feeling and how those feelings translate into different behaviors. OMET elicits both conscious and especially non-conscious thoughts by exploring people's non-literal or metaphoric expressions that drive our behaviors. So behavioral economics has been a huge thing over the past 10 years for market research, and researchers like Daniel Kahneman have taught us that we are not as rational as we think we are. In fact, the primary system in our brain that drives our choices is largely non-conscious and not language-based. So if we really want to understand consumer behavior, we need to understand those underlying feelings, emotions, and automatic responses that are largely in control. So how does this work? Well, we have a database of about 500 images, And respondents are asked to answer questions using images, not words. And it's delivered via survey. So within the survey, we'll do this exercise and they'll select, in this instance, we ask them to select an image that best captures what it means to take a vacation. We then ask them to describe the image. So there's a red convertible cruising down the road with the top down. There is a ribbon of highway. Then interpret it. The red convertible represents carefree and exciting freedom from everyday chores. So we get that data, but then the framework from which we analyze it is baked into metaphor theory. And this is born out of work by Gerald Zaltman, a Harvard sociologist. And his groundbreaking research indicated that there are 7 higher order metaphors that ladder up to and that represent 70% of the way that we orient ourselves to our world. So if we can tap into that underlying metaphor in regard to the unmet need consumers have, how much better can we understand and then respond to their needs? So in our research following the murder of George Floyd, 2 major metaphors came into play. They were journey and transformation. So let's dig into that. And I made the distinction about talking about Black Lives Matter as a movement, not as a specific organization. And so again, I just wanted to reiterate that. So at the time of this research, there was huge support for the movement, with 6 out of 10 people in support. About 2 in 10 were neutral, and another 2 in 10 were against the movement. I did do some research, and this has tapered off since then. I think what is important is that this captures a point in time that is still impactful for brands because they understand how people can react, how people are supportive. And yes, it's not in the forefront of the media and attention anymore, but that sentiment of approval of, fighting for racial inequity is not gone. And so looking deeper in, as you might expect, Black Americans overwhelmingly supported the movement, more so than any other racial group, but support was still strong among other groups, with 59% support among white consumers. And then looking at age cohorts, not surprisingly, our younger 18 to 24-year-olds exhibited the strongest support, with 73% completely or somewhat agreeing with the statement, "I support the Black Lives Matter movement currently happening across the country." And while support wanes in older age groups, it's more than 50% among groups younger than 65 and is exactly 50% among the older age cohort. So further, in regards to geography, and the slides we're seeing here, the green is representing the support, the dark blue represents against, and the light blue is neutral. And so what we're seeing is great support in urban markets, also in suburban and rural markets. Everywhere there was support. There was a large section of these geographies that's unsure of the feelings regarding the movement, as much as 30% in rural communities. So this isn't entirely surprising, since urban communities tend to be younger and is where much of the protests are occurring. And what's encouraging is that the level of support and the group that is undecided and potentially movable that exists in the rural and suburban areas of the country. So again, among party lines, I don't think there are a lot of surprises here either. 79% of respondents identifying as Democrats support the Black Lives Matter movement. Independents are 59%, and 42% of respondents identifying as Republicans supported the movement. Interestingly, with Republicans, you might have expected this group to be strongly opposed to the movement in some instances, but in fact, there's actually a split within the party at the time when it came to opposition versus support. So in order to further unpack this, we looked at a Pew Research Center study that analyzed congressional social media mentions of Black Lives Matter and found a big difference in the mentions of Black Lives Matter among congressional Democrats and Republicans. So if we're going to unpack this chart, starting with the top chart, each square represents a member of Congress. In looking at each member of Congress, the study analyzed all social media posts since 2015 and highlights any member who mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement in their social media. In the top chart, the dark gold is how many congressional members mentioned Black Lives Matter before George Floyd's death. The lighter gold represents after. It's about the same number. What is interesting, however, is when we look at the bottom chart, both before and after George Floyd's death, Republicans rarely mention Black Lives Matter. It's overwhelmingly Democrats who are talking about the movement. Further, the content of social media posts was vastly different across party lines, with Republicans focusing on PPP and pandemic activity after Memorial Day passed, and Democrats focusing heavily on topics around racial injustice. And this is from Twitter or Facebook during the time frame between May 14th and June 14th of 2020. So among Democrats, we see Black Lives Matter, Black Lives, racial injustice, peace protests, and health crisis in the House passed. Among Republicans, there's no mention of Black Lives Matter, only of the National Guard. So given the tendency of media feeds and news stations to follow along party lines, it's not surprising that there's less support and less understanding among Republicans, which suggests that brands, companies, and organizations have an opportunity to lead the charge and come out with positive and supportive messages. And it's one of those chicken or the egg, right? Is there less understanding because Republicans are posting about it less, or are they posting about it less because they think their constituents care about it less? It's one of those things where you just don't know. But consumers aren't as polarized as the politics or media portrays. And that's what we really learn in this research. And perhaps brands need to demonstrate the leadership for broader societal change. And we have seen some of that, I believe, over the course of the year. And I think that brands are continuing to fight that fight in the way that they can, even as kind of maybe the fervor of the movement has died down a little bit. So despite differences in party lines, our research demonstrates that support's still strong among consumers, and by and large, they're committed to fighting for equality. There's a feeling of commitment and necessity that's prevalent among those that supported the movement, and they're also taking the time to listen and learn more about racism and its impact on Black Americans. So in their words, it's difficult and painful, but a necessary and worthy fight. The murder of Mr. Floyd has caused the nation to open their eyes to how this country treats the Black community. It's time to communicate, listen, follow through, and take action to treat everyone with equality. Ultimately, the fight for equality in America is seen as a long journey. Consumers know that this isn't going to change overnight. There is a higher consciousness about it back then and even now, I believe. And it's exacerbated by not just George Floyd's death, but also the racial health inequities that were laid bare by COVID-19 and that we're continuing to see with the vaccine hesitation and distribution data. And there's an optimism that change will come, as we saw Lizzo say, but that time is now, and it's all of our problems to fix, not just that of Black Americans. And this is where we ask a little bit more about the role of brands in this. So 2 of the 7 deep metaphors come into play when it comes to how consumers see this movement: journey and transformation, as I mentioned. The journey metaphor is one that's most prevalent, perhaps when people talk about life. So we often frame life itself as one big journey, for example, including for many an afterlife. And sometimes we think of our lives as a brief journey, as in life is short. Other times we might think it's lengthy, like he still had so much life to live. So you can think of this metaphor and how metaphor can really play into our lives all of the time. And transformation involves changing states or status. So physically, we can go from being laid low by a cold to being up and about. Money can be matured or grown. Emotionally, if we undergo a major life change, we talk about needing attitude adjustments or turning over a new leaf. All of that talking about transformation. So most consumers at the time are exhausted by racism and see it as a never-ending journey to equality. They viewed the movement and protests that accompanied it as a path to a more fair and just society. They felt hopeful that they can eliminate racial inequality through unity and solidarity, because in general, consumers want a more equitable future for their children and for themselves. Things like it's a journey and an uphill battle. You really need multiple people to buy in to succeed, and you'll want to help others along the way, choosing a picture of this journey in the snow. A lot of images of people holding hands were seen through this. I think that's totally understandable as far as needing to representing togetherness and solidarity and having to work together. So in regards to differences between our Black and non-Black respondents, Black respondents were a bit more hopeful and energized about the idea that change will come. They also felt like the journey was more empowering Black people and making them feel heard and giving them a little hope. White respondents didn't talk about this sense of empowerment as much, not surprisingly, because they're not coming from a place of lack of power. But those were some of the differences that we saw there. If we break down the optimism by racial and age segments, We asked respondents to rate their level of optimism that the Black Lives Matter movement would inspire lasting societal change. And so when we look through the data, what we can pay attention to are the large number of those who say unsure. A lot of times we'll call this the movable middle, those that could be convinced or swayed with relevant and authentic messaging. So this large number in the movable middle is in contrast to smaller numbers of people who feel pessimistic that lasting societal change will come about because of Black Lives Matter. And if we look at the total sample, we see that 48% are in support and 28% in that movable middle group, more than the 24% who are pessimistic. So the majority of people are either in total support or in totally thinking that are optimistic, with 28% kind of on the fence, but pushable to one side or the other. Black Americans, Latino, and younger Americans were the most optimistic, but by far and across the board, the movement sparked optimism and hope for lasting change. There was at the time an expectation that it was an inflection point for our country as it comes to racial inequities. I don't know how that's really played out. I mean, I think that it's subjective right now, and it'd be interesting to see if people feel like this movement really sparked lasting change. I think the ways that we're seeing brands speak out indicate that it has, at least from like a corporate responsibility point of view, and from a kind of country consciousness point of view. But we have not fielded this again since it's been 9 months. So that's something to talk about. Of the people who support the movement, we saw an even greater level of optimism that there'll be lasting change. Our more suspicious Gen Xers, 45 to 54, are the outliers with the lowest optimistic view, and we see a big jump from 35 to 44 age cohort. That might be because of the skeptical nature of Gen Xers who never had to fight for freedom and wealth like the Depression and World War II generation, or resist an unjust war, or push the world forward toward racial and sexual justice like the baby boomers. They kind of lived out the tail end of the Cold War and the beginning of the 21st century, punctuated only by 9/11. So all along, they remained on the sidelines, kind of watching prior generations mess things up as they saw it, but not empowered to fix it themselves. So our Gen Xers are a little pessimistic and not really thinking that things are going to change very much. So now that we understand the consumer mind state, one of positivity and ripe for action that promotes lasting change, let's look at what they thought brands should be doing. So Pew Research and other notable studies indicated support and energy behind this movement has waned since this summer, but that hasn't changed. What hasn't changed is the role that brands play, even as public support becomes less fervent. Opinion research study conducted shortly after George Floyd's death found that 71% of Americans think brands have a role in responding to the issue of police violence. And in light of what we saw in the Pew Research and what we know to be true anecdotally regarding how politicized this issue is, it could be that the American population is looking to brands in corporate America to step into the light a little bit and lead some of the change. And I think that's true. Opinion survey also found that 20% of Americans would stop buying from a brand altogether if they felt like a brand's response was hypocritical. Starbucks is an example when previously they had banned Black Lives Matter t-shirts. However, the result in the wake of George Floyd was a boycott Starbucks hashtag, and they quickly changed their response. Maybe too late for some. They have since also donated a lot of money to different causes. And on the other hand, only 6% of Americans said that they would stop buying from a brand that said nothing. And I think with the younger generations, I think we're all marketers and know that Gen Z is very purpose-driven and does buy from brands that they believe in and that are doing things. And so that I think is just going to continue to grow. So 69% of Gen Z are more likely to buy from a company that contributes to social causes. Purchase behavior is driven by perceptions of social values of a brand. It really is. And this was true before COVID and before George Floyd's murder and is now on full display. Not speaking up will likely be considered suspicious by the younger cohort who believe, as Hamilton says of Aaron Burr, if you stand for nothing, what will you fall for? So going back to that statistic that 20% of Americans would stop buying from a brand perceived to behave hypocritically, we believe that stat represents a desire for authenticity. Regardless of what action your brand takes, it can't fly in the face of past behavior. So when brands consider their message and their response to these types of issues, you really have to consider how it ladders up to your brand values. We know from our own research that this has always been important in branding and advertising. Espousing platitudes has never been an effective communication strategy. And I'm sure a lot of you guys saw the COVID montage that somebody put together with all of the ads from all of the brands saying the same thing. It's just not impactful. You have to really have your own voice. And this is why we ask questions in copy testing about, is this believable? Is this relevant? Because in order for a message from your brand to be meaningful, it has to be authentic and feel like something your brand would say. And that's even more important now. So a local example of this requirement that your message reflects your actions is the Ace New Orleans. Back in the summer, their Instagram post supporting Black Lives Matter backfired when former employees began commenting with testimonials, accusing the company of using the identities of its Black and LGBTQ employees to sell their brand, but did nothing when employees were harassed or held back over some people with the same identities. An account that typically garnered fewer than 10 comments per post saw over 900 comments on this post in June. So across the board, consumers are responding to such instances as allyship without accountability is just not enough. And so they sought to mitigate the damage done by posting the actions they were planning in response. For some, it was too little too late, and you kind of wonder what the damage will be done down the road, and how younger consumers who support social causes with their wallets will punish these brands. On a smaller, even more local level, there's a backlash against Academy Sports because someone witnessed the harassment and arrest of a young Black male wearing a hoodie. He was standing in line with his friend to pay and was accused of stealing. Instead of the security guard dealing with this, the police were called. 6 police cars showed up. Excessive, yes. Was Academy called out? Yes. So it's not enough to stand up in support of Black Lives Matter. The values and mission that your brand brings to the table in response to this changing dynamic needs to be ingrained in employees and internalized in the corporate culture. A lot of these PR nightmares occur because of one single employee acting alone. So the question becomes, how can you educate, train, and instill the same values you're communicating to consumers throughout your organization? How can you live your values? So an example of a brand that is doing things right is Nike. Nike has been a leader among brands as they were ahead of the curve in renewing Colin Kaepernick as a spokesperson for the 30th anniversary of Just Do It in September 2018. And because of their willingness to back an individual criticized for standing up against police brutality and racial injustice early on, and willing to lose his job over it, when they released their ad in support of Black Lives Matter, consumers responded positively. It felt authentic. Consumers believed them. In the campaign, with the message, believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything, had more than 10,000 retweets and 19,000 likes within the first 2 hours it was posted. And, and the resonance with Colin Kaepernick, where it's believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything, it really rings true. Because what did he sacrifice to stand up for his beliefs? So I'm going to play the ad for you guys. Sorry. So a powerful ad, believable coming from Nike because it's a message they've always espoused. And they really live into that. And so in our research, what do consumers say? Well, they generally believe that yes, brands should speak out in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. Younger consumers, people of color, and Democrats are all much more likely than their counterparts to feel this way. What's interesting to note is that there are a lot of neither agree nor disagree responses, indicating consumers don't always know what brands should be doing. But even among those groups with lower support, there are more people saying that brands should speak out. For example, white consumers, 45% say yes, you should speak out. 25% don't know, but 30% disagree that brands should speak out. So it's an opportunity for brands to take a position and demonstrate leadership. And the data suggests that brands would be rewarded for it, at the very least, not punished. Now, I did recently find and learn about, there was a group that started an Instagram account for brand silent, I think it's Silent Brands. And they would call out people who hadn't said anything yet, just via that Instagram feed. So silence, even in some instances, was becoming an issue, not just about not speaking up, but like, don't be silent. So who's doing what? What brands are doing what? So the NBA had its highest scoring ad ever, according to Ace Metrics, and we'll take a look at it. The challenge was that in the open-ended responses, consumers really weren't sure what the NBA was doing to address the problems identified. So we can look at the ad and kind of look at it critically as far as what people want from brands.
This is a moment. We got to keep pushing forward. We want change. We want justice. Took the time to come here and work, and take the time to vote. That's our power.
Some of the injustices that we've been seeing is not okay.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want?
Let us be perfectly clear. Black Lives Matter.
So you can see they're acknowledging that there's a problem, but they're not saying what the brand's going to do to help. So that was a little bit of a disconnect for consumers. They really liked the ad, they emotionally connected to it, but in the open ends, they were like, okay, so now what? What does that mean? Like, what are you going to do? And that would have, if the NBA would have said kind of they were going to donate, they were going to do something, it would have really helped consumers believe. So in contrast, let's take a look at Papa John's spot.
All right, let's roll. All right, here we go. Go ahead and roll sound. Pizza's here. It's pizza time.
Why?
Hello, how are you?
Is that Shaq? Oh my God.
How are you, little princess?
What are you doing in a box?
I'm a board member and a store owner at Papa John's, and this is my brand new piece of the Shaq-a-roni. Just by ordering the Shaq-a-roni, $1 from each pizza is donated to Papa John's Foundation to support communities, COVID relief, the fight against racial injustice, Boys and Girls Club of America, and general community involvement.
I love it. That's awesome.
That's amazing.
Thanks for the pizza. Thanks for coming and visit us. Shaq-a-roni in the house.
You guys smiling?
So you can see it's more retail, it's a product-oriented advertisement, but it ties into what they're actually doing to support communities. And so we saw that with both Black Lives Matter and COVID. Consumers were okay being marketed to, as long as the ad's not tone deaf, and even better if there's an acknowledgement of the current cultural context. So be authentic is one of the key takeaways from our research. Take a hard look at your brand and how it's perceived before taking a stand. Stress test messages with employees and customers before launching. Communicate your actions that you're taking in support of the movement, not just support of the movement. The second thing that's critical for brands to do in the wake of this movement was to take action. Bricks and Diamond, a chief executive of diversity consulting firm Big Answers, recently said in a Washington Post article, consumers believe that now is the time for action. An ad campaign of support is not going to be enough. We've seen brands handle this differently across the board. Many are hiring chief diversity officers. I think we've seen some of that locally as well, acknowledging that there needs to be an owner for ensuring racial equity and implementing programs to support the company's values and mission. We've also seen brands being called out for not saying anything. Like I mentioned, there's an Instagram account, Silent Brands, highlighting brands that had not spoken out. So other ways brands are taking action other than ads and donations were partnerships. So back in the summer, Unilever's Caress was trying to address the problem by committing $1 million to iFund Women of Color to support business coaching for women of color, entrepreneurs, and small business owners. They commented that it's important that we not only support ideas, but also recognize and work to dismantle the systems that have disenfranchised communities of color, especially the Black community, for too long. And this is an example of a brand taking a leadership role, recognizing that action is the only thing that will impact systemic structural issues in our society. And it really re-energized the Caress brand. Mariska mentioned this at the start. The latest example of brands speaking out in support of racial justice and equality are all the Atlanta brands that publicly condemned Senate Bill 202 relating to voting rights. Major League Baseball moved their All-Star game out of Atlanta. And nobody seems fazed by calls from the far right to boycott, because in reality, based on this research, the majority of the country supports racial equity and a large percent support brands that stand for something. So the movement has, I think, made a difference. It has overall changed a little bit of consumer perception and made it maybe a little less political. And so, there's a few Republicans who are calling for boycotts of Delta and Coke, and we haven't really seen that impact those two businesses yet. So back to the research, what did consumers think brands should do? In line with the underlying metaphors of journey and transformation, consumers expressed that structural changes like ensuring diversity in hiring practices, holding racial sensitivity trainings, volunteering with and donating to local Black communities were all more effective than topical responses like creating an ad or posting on social media or even donating to the official memorial fund of George Floyd. Consumers, not just activists, wanted brands to make systemic changes, not just topical ones. Again, note that there's a lot of don't knows and very little opposition to these actions. And further, when we broke this data across race, gender, and political affiliation, the top 4 items remained at the top, underscoring the importance for action. So, second point, taking action. Evaluate your internal policies and procedures for bias. Train leadership to identify and mitigate racial bias through sensitivity training. You can take action by giving to Black communities and organizations through volunteer opportunities or donations. And you can talk to your employees and customers and tell them what you're doing. So the final thing that brands can do is look at the data. We've talked about authenticity and action. Let's talk about the data. As a research firm, we'd be remiss to make recommendations that didn't include a dive into your brand metrics. 41% of Black Americans said they feel that brands don't understand their experience. And how would they? When you look at the way we conduct research to understand what consumers want from a brand, we have to look and criticize ourselves for how we're whitewashing the data. If we're looking at general population, which is the entire swath of the people in the United States, then the data is going to naturally skew to represent the perspective of white Americans and minimize the distinctions that the data shows. And so when we do this, we're finding some surprising, so when we look at it differently, we find some surprising differences. We have to be in the market research world, and even as advocates of brands, we have to be critical of the way that we're looking at research and make sure that we're understanding the experiences of Black and Brown Americans as well as white Americans. Because when you separate it out and you have enough data for statistical significance, there are differences in the way that Black Americans, Brown Americans, and white Americans think, consume, buy. So here's a few examples of what happens when you look at things with a lens towards diversity. So we worked with Louisiana Public Health Institute to really understand exposure to secondhand smoke and cessation and how to inspire behavioral and attitudinal changes. And one of the trends that we noticed was that we learned through the research that was that Black men were less accepting of some of the programs that had been in place. And so through this research, we learned that Black men were distrustful of quasi-governmental organizations that were disseminating the cessation aids. Black men needed to have them endorsed by more local and community-based groups. It wasn't just change your message to talk to these individuals, to move them to action and inspire behavior change. It was about how the message is communicated, how it's distributed, what is the media strategy and the community outreach strategy. As part of one of our weekly trackers at this time, we looked at the intersection of COVID and Black Americans' experience with healthcare as well. And while we don't have the time to go through all of our findings, of course, here's what consumers said when we were talking about Black Americans' access to healthcare. And that's that many Black consumers have personal experiences to draw from when thinking about unequal access to healthcare. And we found some really, really powerful images as far as a skunk, because healthcare for Black Americans stinks because people treat us differently when we get seen and show our insurance, or people struggling through mud. It's already difficult to navigate healthcare, but for many Black people, doctors and nurses don't take our pain complaints seriously. And that is backed up by data over and over again. So what Black Americans can do that their white American counterparts sometimes struggle with is connect these individual inequalities, in this case for healthcare, with broader structural issues. So Black consumers were the ability to kind of connect it all, as far as this example of drowning in expenses and lack of access to proper healthcare because of low income and job opportunities. We're not equal enough to have easy access to the things we need to survive, not just healthcare. We suffer from unemployment, underemployment, and are still dying at higher rates than other parts of the population. So really connecting these inequalities to the broader structural issues that are at hand. And aside from what these individuals are saying, these images are really dire as far as people drowning, cemeteries to represent their experience. And this is how Black Americans think of healthcare in this country. And so in our research and in the full deep dive, white Americans saw healthcare inequities as an isolated issue for the most part that can be resolved. They didn't and don't necessarily understand the intersection with larger structural issues in our country that results in the racial inequities that we see, and that lead to things like a bigger impact of COVID-19 on the Black American population. Breaking it down a little bit, white consumers, you can see, they subconsciously view healthcare and inequality for Black Americans as a problem that should be solved, whereas Black consumers subconsciously view healthcare inequality as one of many structural problems that needs a holistic solution. So it's kind of those differences that are really the difference between the way white consumers articulate and understand the issue. So this is the immediate next step for all brands if you haven't already done this, and that's to truly understand how Black consumers experience your brand and how that differs from other consumers. It requires listening deeply, it requires research, it requires some humility and understanding and realizing, hey, we haven't looked at this in that way. It's okay to admit that, fix it now. One of our clients asked us to go back through 4 huge studies to recut and reanalyze the data, segmenting by Black and white, and the findings were powerful and led to some changes in the way that they approach their marketing and customer experience strategies. They do need to be different, and that's something that we're finding across the board. So look at the data is the third key action for brands to take. Identify a few research studies that are key and foundational and review it with a lens towards diversity. Determine areas where Black Americans are underserved by your brand, either internally and externally, and take action through specific initiatives that address these areas. So as a recap, what brands can do is be authentic, put your money where your mouth is, or don't talk. Take action, don't just offer support through donations. You can also volunteer and try to change your corporate culture. Look at the data, understand how Black consumers experience your brand, and because only then can you really begin to address how you might be underserving or underrepresenting that community. So there was a sense at the time that this was different, that this particular moment in time is sparking a movement for racial justice. I think that we've seen, again, that fervor decrease, but I think that there has been impactful and lasting change as we see brands continue to stand up and speak out when they're seeing racial inequity. And that's it.
Perfectly timed, Stephanie. I'm impressed. That was fantastic. So much fantastic data, and I love the sharing of all the different ads. It really helps bring it to life. We've had a good online chat going as you were presenting. So just please, to our audience, please submit any questions. I'd love to have a little bit of a conversation here. Maybe other examples of what's happening locally, like Stephanie mentioned at the Ace Hotel. Someone asked if you can show the first take action slide.
Yes.
Darnell.
Which one? This one?
Maybe be authentic. Good. We got a good Darnell. I do think authenticity is such a huge piece of it, because otherwise it just rings totally hollow. And that's what I personally was feeling from a lot of the emails that we were getting in the spring of last year and early summer of last year, that people are like, oh, I just need to get an email out there. So I thought, the point about taking action, I had a question because the Nike ad didn't really have an action component to it, yet it seemed like it got pretty high, feedback. Was that just because Nike has been so consistent in this space?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's more, I think the point is it was an accepted message. People felt, they wanted to hear what Nike was going to say in this instance, because they have been so vocal in this space in the past. And I think because they do take regular action.
Yeah, they have a history of taking action. I just think Shaq is so cute. He just watching that ad with Papa John's.
I know. I thought that was great. There were some other examples of I think it was Burger King that did a social media campaign of, make your own Whopper, a recipe of how to make a Whopper. And again, that's the contextual advertising that people were okay with at the time. Make it about what's going on. Don't ignore what's going on and just try to get me to buy a Whopper, make it about what's going on.
So we have a good question coming in from Kendra Clark. Hi, Kendra. She asked, do you think that the consumer research industry has also felt the shift in the movement towards racial equality? This was such a great presentation, and it would be wonderful if other research companies were able to present data with a similar mindset. Oh, good point.
Which industry? I'm sorry.
Your industry, so consumer research. Do you sort of feel like you're one of the only ones thinking about this, or are there other research companies?
Yeah, we saw a ton of people, talking about COVID-19 and a lot less talking about this movement. I think that there is a little bit, I think you're right. I mean, there is a little bit of chatter around how we look at data, but not a ton. And I know that internally at MDRG, we've come up with some policies as far as always ask the client if they'd like to oversample their minority populations, to give them that opportunity. And then our internal research like this, we always oversample, but it is definitely difficult. I think brands, unfortunately, are leading that more than the research companies are right now, as far as asking for it. So the really good research firms will proactively recommend it, but I do think brands are still leading that.
Yeah. And Kendra is actually on the diversity, equity, inclusion task force for the American Marketing Association. So Kendra, I'm wondering if this is something we can take back to AMA and say, hey, is there something that we can do with the other AMA members that are with research companies, to be promoting this kind of mindset, so that instead of just waiting for the brand to request it, that the research companies kind of lead with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Go ahead, Anna. I just saw another question come in.
Oh yeah. Gabriel asked, do you feel like some companies are expressing their position in social issues just to be bandwagoners? Do you think they cause more damage than good?
Yeah, and they do cause more damage. If you are not doing the things that you're saying, it's going to be a problem, just like the Ace Hotel. That was definitely, everybody felt the need to say something. But if you haven't acted that way, then keep your mouth shut, because if you can't back it up, or I mean, you have to acknowledge what you've done in the past that maybe is insensitive or incorrect, and say, here's what we're going to do to be better. Because otherwise, if you can't back it up, you will be called out. I mean, this is a cancel culture, whether we like it or not, and it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I thought the quote was really good that you included, Stephanie, about like, I appreciate your Black Lives Matter posts. Now follow that up with a picture of your senior management team and your board, because that was the question that I was going to ask you. Like, I felt like Nike's posts or Nike's ad resonated, but I'm pretty sure that their executive team is mostly a bunch of white guys. So it's still hard for me to believe what they're saying because of that.
Right. Yeah. And so that's where you've seen a lot of companies hiring chief diversity officers. So I think, Hancock Whitney recently created that position, and they probably definitely needed it. So I mean, I think it's that acknowledgement. And if people see that acknowledgement of, hey, we got to do something here, that's helpful. And like Nike, sure, that might be who their leaders are, but the things that they're doing in the public eye make a difference, but even the way you treat employees, that gets around and people know about that, and that's a part of your reputation. So it's not just what you say in the public sphere or what you're doing out in the community. You have to live your brand all the way through. So I think, that's just something that we've seen in a lot of different research. When it relates to brands and people reacting to it, they'll often say something about, yes, but I know somebody who works there and they do XYZ. And that's kind of like, well, that's not what their brand stands for. And it does, it permeates the community and people know that.
Yeah. Darnell has a question in the chat. Do you see more consumers supporting Black businesses during this movement? I know in the Black community, the conversation is to support Black-owned establishments.
Anecdotally, yes, but that's not research. I think that's a great question to ask if we were to do a follow-up study, to understand if people are more consciously choosing to support Black-owned businesses.
A quick question around gender. Was there any breakout in male, female with in the original data set around support of Black Lives Matter? I know you broke it down by race and by age.
I don't think, if we did look at it, we didn't see major differences, and that's why it's not highlighted.
Okay, that's good. That would be good.
Yeah.
And I wanted to touch on, in the February conversation where we were talking about diversity done right, that was a big part of our takeaway in that session, was how diversity, in order for it to be effective, needs to not just be a marketing initiative, but something that is really pursued throughout the entire organization, as one of the slides that Stephanie showed, from your hiring practices to the products you're developing, to the marketing, to the communications. So it really has to be integrated throughout the entire company. It's a culture. Well, I know we're nearing the hour. I don't know, Stephanie, if you had any final thoughts.
No, feel free, if you guys, I'm happy to share this presentation. If you want to ping me either on LinkedIn or via my email, I can share it in the chat real quick. I'm happy to send you a PDF.
Awesome. I know I have a lot of friends, colleagues that I'd like to share it with, and I'm sure others do too. So
and then I'm also going to put in the chat, no, it went away from me. What did I do? We have, so our regular tracker, if you sign up for it, I think we're doing it quarterly right now. We asked different topics. Right now, it was about vaccine hesitancy and tourism impact by COVID and how that's changing over the summer. But there's some good info in there in case you are working with some brands that might be interested in how consumer behavior is changing over time.
Great. And I just encourage everyone to just think locally about how to promote racial equity from our schools. There's actually a lot of activity going on right now among our K through 12 schools in terms of things like name changes, road name changes. So there's, this isn't just businesses, but it's across all of our industries, healthcare, education, criminal justice. All of these things have an element of a brand. Schools are a brand. Healthcare institutions are a brand. So yes, it's marketing related, but we as consumers and marketers should be, part of this influence, acting as influencers. All right, well, with that said, I'm going to quickly promote, again, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you, MDRG, for sharing you with us today. Next month, mid-month, we have our regular marketers meetup. It's become quite a popular go-to session. It's always the second Wednesday of the month. Everyone is welcome. It's free, whether you're a member or not a member. And all we do is talk shop the whole time. Usually come up with a couple of topics that people get talking. So please join us on Wednesday, May 12th. And then at the end of the month, Anna is still working on this, but I think we're going to be doing something around festivals. We're trying to pull in some different chief marketing officers from different festivals around town. So even though we might not be in festival, there are not a lot of festivals right now, we can still talk about it, get together and talk about festival marketing. So stay tuned for that event for the end of May. And again, thank you everyone for being here today, and we'll see you next time. Have a great afternoon. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, you guys.